Hello, charming class. Mrs. Bizier here, and today I'm going to be talking about virtue ethics, specifically Aristotelian virtue ethics, which comes from your reading. I'm going to just cover what Aristotle had to say about virtue ethics, and then I'm going to talk about some objections to virtue ethics. So, virtue ethics is a little bit unlike the previous ethical theories we've discussed. Utilitarianism, Kantianism, divine command ethics, all of these things had to do with the action. What do you do to be a good person? Virtue ethics is a little bit different. It focuses on the person, on the agent. It asks, how do you become a good person? So Aristotle is really the father of virtue ethics. Aristotle goes way back. He was a student of Plato and Socrates. Plato, you'll remember from week number 1. And Aristotle was really concerned with how do we develop a moral disposition? How do we become a good person? Aristotle said, let's study the good so that we can become good people. Otherwise, what's the point? Good question. Why was Aristotle interested in becoming a good person? Because Aristotle's entire focus was on the goal of a human life. He was very concerned with telos, the goal. For Aristotle, everything in the universe had a purpose. It had a goal. An acorn had a goal to grow into an oak tree. All human beings have a goal called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a fancy Greek word for the good life. It's often translated as flourishing. One of my teachers back in Chicago called it the kind of life that good parents wish for their children. That's what Aristotle wanted humans to have, eudaimonia. Part of that is a virtuous disposition, being a good person. So Aristotle said, let's study the good and we can discover how to become good. Very unlike previous ethical theories we've discussed, like Kant or Mill, Aristotle said there is no general rule. You can't write down, this is the way to be good. There's no categorical imperative. He said we can only give an outline, and then each person needs to focus on the specifics on their own. In this way, Aristotle said it's like medicine. You don't give every person who walks into the ER antibiotics, right? You have a general outline of how to treat somebody, and then you look at each individual situation. That is what virtue is according to Aristotle. So what's the outline? The outline for Aristotle is called the golden mean. It's the middle. Aristotle gives a famous example of bravery. On the one hand, he said, you've got excess. On the other hand, you have a deficiency. For bravery, on the one hand, you've got someone who runs away from everything. They're a coward. They're cowardly. That's a vice. On the other hand, you have someone who has absolutely no fear and just rushes headfirst into every situation. They are too rash. That's a vice. Vice, vice. In the middle, the golden mean, you have someone who is brave. They're not too afraid. They're not too much of a coward. They're not too brash. They don't rush into every situation. They're the balance between the two vices. And that's virtue. That's the golden mean for Aristotle. Virtue's in the middle. He said this is true in everything. In health, eating way too much, you're a glutton. You don't eat enough. He said you're a bore if you have no fun. In the middle, there's the healthy balance, the golden mean. One really interesting thing about the golden mean is it's not the same for everyone. Aristotle does write there's only one way to be virtuous, right? That's to take the two vices, find the middle. The middle, though, is going to be different for different people. So think about our example of bravery. Say you have a soldier in a war, okay? For the soldier, running away as being a coward, rushing into battle without any support, without obeying the commands from the superiors, that's too brash. In the middle, you have a soldier standing their ground, obeying the commands from their superiors, not rushing in. That's brave. In the same situation, what if you have a civilian, right? Running away from danger for a civilian might be the way to go. Let's say being coward is just standing paralyzed in place with fear. But for a civilian, standing your ground in the middle of the battlefield, that's way too brash. For the civilian, the answer is the same, the golden mean, but the action is different. Retreating and seeking shelter might be in between frozen with fear, paralyzed in place, Or standing your ground and meet the opposing armies. If you're not a trained soldier, standing your ground looks too brash. You need the middle. Aristotle gives an example in the reading that you did for class. He talks about food, okay? In between, you've got too much food, which makes you boorish, overweight, too little food, too skinny, too weak. Right in the middle, the right amount of food. The right amount of food depends on the person, okay? He says if you're an athletic trainer, that right amount of food is going to be different than if you are a very small, weak person. Every person needs a different amount. It's still the mean. It's the mean between too much and too little. Too much and too little vary depending on the person, and so does the mean. So that's unlike utilitarianism, which says you must do the action that produces the greatest amount of happiness, no matter who you are. Unlike Kantian ethics, which says you must do that which you could will be a universal law, no matter who you are, virtue ethics says it depends on your situation, it depends on your circumstances, it depends on the type of person you are. That mean might vary. All right, how do we follow the golden mean? Aristotle goes into this. He says there's one way to become virtuous. Be virtuous. You learn by doing. You do virtuous acts, you perform bravery, you are a temperate, generous person with justice, and that's how you develop a habit of being virtuous. You work on those habits of being virtuous and you become a virtuous person. Become brave by doing brave things, become just by doing just things. When do you start? For Aristotle, you start in your youth. The habits you establish as a young person are absolutely critical for Aristotle. That lays the foundation for your virtuous future. Now, lest you think that virtue ethics began and ended in ancient Greece with Aristotle, I'm also having you read a passage from Kidder from your textbook, which is How do Good People Make Tough Decisions. Kidder is a modern virtue ethicist, and you'll notice when you read that passage that Kidder talks about moral fitness. You have to practice being a moral person so that when you're put to the test in that moment, you'll make the right decision. This is what Aristotle was saying. So Kidder's ideas are thousands of years old. All right, couple of objections to Aristotle's virtue ethics. The first objection was raised by Aristotle's teacher, Plato, in a dialogue called Meno. There are two virtues here, or two objections to the virtue theory here. The first objection is, can you teach it? Do people have to learn it on their own, or can you teach virtue? If you can't teach virtue, then it seems a little bit unfair. And Plato thought you can't teach virtue. His first example was, in the dialogue, Socrates said, show me the teacher. Show me someone who claims that they can teach virtue. There is nobody out there who says, I'm a teacher of virtue. There are no students of virtue. All right, that's the first objection. I think you wouldn't have to look too hard to find someone who claims they can teach you virtue. But Socrates makes a second objection, and I think it's more powerful. Socrates says, okay, I think you can all think of someone who fits this example. Look at, let's call him George. Look at George. He's a self-made man. He's upstanding. He's a very wonderful citizen. Everyone looks up to him and admires him. Look at his son. Oh, his son is a wreck. He's not a virtuous person. He's not a nice person. Nobody respects him. The son is not qualified to follow in the father's footsteps. If you could teach virtue, then wouldn't George, he's a pinnacle of virtue in the community, wouldn't George have taught the most important person in his life, his child? Wouldn't he have taught his son how to be virtuous? I think that's a pretty good objection. All right, the second objection, which is a bit of a problem with the definition, is that the concept of virtue changes over time in certain ways. We still think it's very virtuous to be brave, just like Aristotle. Justice, that's a great virtue. But what about something like chastity? This was very prized in the Middle Ages, right? It was important that the ladies be chaste. These days, turn on the TV, chastity is not as important as it once was. It might still be important to individuals, which is also a bit of a problem with virtue ethics. You can have something very important to an individual. Let's say I believe that chastity really matters to me. Okay, it's not a virtue shared by my society. So, second and third objections. Virtue changes over time. Is that a problem? Third objection. Can you have a personal virtue that's different from the virtues of your society? Good questions. All right, class. Enjoy the readings for this week. Don't forget about the quiz, and just email me if you have any questions.